Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about why Hedera Hashgraph going open source is likely to be good for the value of HBAR over time. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So I'll talk about our risk indicators in a second, because I always like to touch on those when I talk about different assets. But with Hedera Hashgraph, I want to first focus on some more just fundamental news that I thought was noteworthy, and I think bears mentioning when we think about where the value of HBAR might go over time. So those who are familiar with the Hedera Hashgraph are familiar with the fact that it uses a novel and unique consensus mechanism, or in fact, in complete organization of its protocol, right? It's not a blockchain. It uses a hash graph, which is a novel and unique way of essentially organizing one of these networks. And initially, that whole protocol had been patented. So Hashgraph had been a patented technology that only Hedera Hashgraph could use, that no other blockchains could use it, no one could create a fork, anything like that. It was not open source, it was patented. And that was something that actually was a source of criticism for Hedera Hashgraph for a while, but now they're going open source. They're moving it open source. So that's just what we're looking at here. This article is just talking about that. And the reason that they give is that they think, that opening up the source code, making it publicly usable, will increase growth in the ecosystem further. And I think that's true. And I think there's different reasons why that maybe go a little bit beyond what they're talking about right here. So the first reason why I think this is a good news, this is kind of the low-hanging fruit of why I think this is good news, is just that I think it helps them cover their base a lot of some of the areas that they got attacked on. Here I'm just showing you an investing.com article back from earlier this year, and a number of the criticisms that are brought forward, or some of the ones that have been leveled, are things like how the proprietary nature of Hashgraph could limit its use further on, that developers aren't able to fork the protocol to make novel protocols using the Hashgraph system, and that there's a lot of competition in the blockchain space, and so anyone looking for a fork, as they can easily find a competitor. So by making Hashgraph proprietary, they're limiting out on a lot of growth that could happen with Hashgraph. But that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, right? So that just makes sense that if that was a source bot, then this is good from the perspective that people can't be complaining about that anymore. But I think that if we think more about the long-term value proposition of this move, I think it makes more sense from the perspective of adoption. And what do I mean by that? Well, in crypto, these being networks that we're fundamentally talking about, right? Blockchain is inherently a network-based technology. One of the things that gives any kind of technology that's around a network value is users. The more users of a technology, oftentimes the more valuable that technology becomes. I mean, you have to look no further than something like Ethereum to kind of see that in action, right? Ethereum being the first layer one blockchain kind of as we know it, with implementing EVM and smart contracts and things like that. Just look at what Ethereum has been able to do based just on network effects with that technology. Like from the very bottom to the very top, we're talking about over a 1,000,000% move to the upside in Ethereum's price. Just bonkers. Currently sitting up at around 600,000% move to the upside. And again, imagine if Ethereum had done that, had made EVM proprietary, right? Imagine if they had made smart contracts proprietary, that only they and their development team could develop with it, no one else could build on top of it. I don't think you would have seen anything near this amount of growth if they had done that, because again, there's only so much that one development team can do at a time. You can only kind of push so much out from one team if you keep everything proprietary. But by making it open source, the idea is that if you have this one network, Ethereum, that is encouraging a lot of people to use its technology and integrate with it, suddenly that can create these network effects that brings a ton of people to the space and just can create a lot of wealth as a result. People are quite likely to come into a network like this if they can build using the technology, then profit themselves, and then their knowledge and their innovation will then go back into strengthening the network and help it improve over time. And that's where I really see this being advantageous for HBAR potentially down the line. The idea being that, obviously, I think a lot of people at the beginning sometimes saw, on the flip side of the criticism around the patented technology, some people actually saw that as a strength of HBAR, right? This idea of this kind of moat as it's sometimes called, this idea that because only Hedera Hashgraph could use Hashgraph, then advantages of the Hashgraph technology would all be captured within the Hedera network, and so therefore there might be some security in that perspective. But I actually think that, you know, the risk of opening it up for competition, I think, is outweighed by the network effects that this could bring in. Because you can imagine that if you believe that Hashgraph is a superior technology to some of the other blockchains out there, and I think a lot of HBAR bulls, my reading of the situation is that most people are here because of the technology, right? That's why many people are HBAR believers. So if you really believe that, if that's really your thesis that HBAR is a great technology, you'd want to see things happen that should make that technology better over time and be able to continue to keep its kind of competitive advantage over alternative blockchain systems or forms of or consensus mechanisms, organization, etc. And that's where I think making this open source could be advantageous. Because one thing that's useful to note is that, you know, Hedera Hashgraph just is way ahead on developing on Hashgraph because they've had it for so long. So it's unlikely that some upstart could just take the source code and make a better network right off the get-go. You know, Hedera Hashgraph has literally the inventor of Hashgraph on their team. It's unlikely that someone who's never worked with it before could suddenly come out with something that's so much better that could outcompete HBAR. So I think there's a lot of security just in the fact that there's this huge head start and a lot of adoption that's already happened. It's unlikely that someone can just beat that. But then in addition to that, what could happen is that if Hashgraph becomes more of a used technology in the space and more people start building on it, then the value of Hashgraph as a technology should grow with that. Any innovations that come about from these other projects that could get built as forks of essentially forks of Hedera Hashgraph, or just other things that use Hashgraph, any innovations they create could be used in the Hedera Hashgraph network, because that's how open source works, right? You're basically sharing innovation across projects. That anything that one person discovers that's innovative can then be used by other people. It makes the whole technology better. And that's one of the advantages of open source, right? Is that you're able to crowdsource innovation. It's not just one centralized entity that is responsible for all the innovation. They basically let the community create the innovation and then build from there. Obviously, Hedera Hashgraph had been doing some of that already, right? They were getting a lot of community buy-in, community development on top of Hashgraph. But if you talk about the literal nuts and bolts of the underlying Hashgraph technology itself, up until now that had been proprietary. That won't be anymore. So now it's much more readily possible probably to make that core technology even better than it had been if you can crowdsource it, get additional people to use it. And especially as the Hedera Hashgraph ecosystem or technology, as the network will evolve and things like sharding will get introduced, make it even faster, some of those innovations might even be quicker if there are now multiple projects that could be working on similar things, or things that the Hedera Hashgraph team maybe haven't even thought of yet. Maybe someone else who comes to the space will think about that can make the whole system better. And so generally speaking, for my opinion, if this is a superior technology, Hashgraph, then it's probably a good thing to let it become a widely used system within the space, because then it could really start to take developers away from other projects. It could start to take interest from other technologies, and then maybe start to shift the more of the ecosystem to using this type of technology. And who knows, maybe there might be technologies that only Hashgraph can enable that could then develop that would be innovative that we haven't even seen yet. So that's all very speculative, obviously. But just in my personal opinion, I see there being more benefits to this move than drawbacks. And I know that some people might not see it that way. Some people might have preferred to see HBAR, Hedera Hashgraph being the only network using this mechanism. But my opinion is that the network effects that come from open source is probably going to outweigh any potential risks of competition by making it open source. Just my opinion, but those are my thoughts on that. And so that's one reason why I think it's reasonable to be bullish on that particular piece of news. Just my take. So I do want to talk a little bit more just about HBAR's price action in the macro perspective. Then I'm going to shift over to our risk indicator just to see what it's saying right now about HBAR's price action. So one thing I think is remarkable about HBAR when you just look at its history over time, so if here we're just looking at its entire price history, is how it seems to kind of go through phases so far, where you kind of see these big moves to the upside, a lot of sideways movement, big move to the upside, more or less sideways movement. And who knows, maybe we're getting ready for that next big move to the upside that could set that next kind of stepping stone. potentially that could be HBAR's price history. And obviously, you know, recently HBAR has started to show some strength again. It actually kind of had its breakout volume kind of day actually one day before Bitcoin, just yesterday, which was actually kind of interesting. HBAR actually kind of led the market in a way by pumping before the rest of it, which is something that was interesting to observe. Now, who's to say if that's going to always happen? But it was also notable in light of the fact that HBAR was also one of the few altcoins that actually rallied alongside Bitcoin back in early of January of 21, where most altcoins actually waited till much later in the month after Bitcoin had put in its big move to run. It's interesting that HBAR also kind of led the market at that time as well. So just something to keep an eye on that I think is interesting behavior from HBAR that's seemed to kind of set it apart from some other altcoins sometimes in terms of its price action. And then also I did just want to note that along with frankly a number of other assets as well, it is just notable that this downtrend in the RSI for HBAR, which is basically just this kind of negative momentum leaving the space, now just got broken to the upside. So it'll be interesting to see if that can then translate into a further upside going forward. And to add to this conversation, I do want to switch over here to our risk indicator for HBAR. So this is the upside downside potential indicator. It's our risk indicator here on the channel. Here we're just looking at the UDPI, the price history of HBAR color coded based on the UDPI, and you see it does a good job of identifying these low risk zones, you know, down closer to -5, as well as these higher risk zones up closer to +5, where the low risk zones tend to be good accumulation zones, and then these red areas or these kind of darker orange areas oftentimes are good times to distribute. So, you know, you'd see the risk rising through this move, and then that kind of precipitated this fall, this correction that we saw. But what you probably noticed immediately when you saw this graph was we're back down here in the green zone. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting to look at, I should note that this is the long-term version of the UDPI, by the way. So this cares about moves that play out over months to years. So looking at the longer-term time frame. One of the things I think is useful or interesting to note is just how the symmetry that we've actually developed over the last year or so, a little less than a year, coming out of the summer, right? So HBAR had done that huge pump up in the, early of 2021 before the correction. We then came down to around -3 on the UDPI, bounced off of it, had that big nice rally to the upside, putting in a new all-time high, and then we corrected down to basically the exact same level, right? So this was slightly lower, but not, you know, virtually identical level, -3 more or less. And it looks like we're bouncing off it again. Now, does that mean we will do this again? Who knows? But it's possible, right? Because this HBAR has shown that this level in the past has been able to provide that kind of support, you could think of it. Kind of, we've realized enough of the downside to maybe have risk cool off enough to be able to set us up for moves to the upside. Maybe that can happen again. Now, I do think that a lot of this is going to be contingent on the broader market, right? If Bitcoin remains strong, if it's able to hold around, you know, 40K as support or even continue to rise up to 45K or higher, then I think HBAR will be primed to just catapult. I think it'll be able to shoot up pretty well. Now, does that mean we have to go and set new all-time highs? No, not guaranteed by any means in the short term, but certainly a rally out of these this kind of correction that we've been in seems very plausible in that kind of broader market sentiment. I would absolutely expect HBAR to be able to do well should the broader market start to look more bullish as well. And really, at my kind of general longer-term thesis with HBAR is that as there's more development that happens, if we can start really seeing the Hashgraph technology flex its muscles, and especially if it can kind of prove its worth and actually demonstrate that it's superior to all these other technologies in a broad way, you know, if there's a lot of DeFi adoption that comes to it, a lot of other use cases that get built on top of it, that would just be positive. But I do think we're going to get to a point with HBAR fairly soon where that use case is going to start happening, and that's really when the rubber's going to meet the road, right? That's where everyone who's been here based on the promise of Hashgraph, based on the potential of Hashgraph, then we're going to see how it actually performs. And then I think the valuation of HBAR is going to be a lot more dependent on its actual kind of performance as a network rather than just merely its potential, which I think is what everyone has been, by and large, investing in so far. Not that people aren't using HBAR yet. Obviously, it is getting adoption across a bunch of different spaces. But I think as it starts to really realize some of those use cases, then people are going to be assessing, all right, how well is it actually performing with those use cases? And if it does well with them, then I think it could just very well do even better. And then if Hashgraph gets adopted more widely, it could do well in that case also. But of course, with anything like this, you have to keep an open mind. You have to evaluate it as it happens. And so, if in some world HBAR or the Hashgraph network wouldn't be able to live up to its potential, that would be something to take note of as well. Now, I'm not spreading FUD here. I'm not saying there's any reason to expect that at all. I personally think the Hashgraph technology is quite strong. I see no reason why it can't do well. But if it didn't, that would be something to be concerned about. And so that's where I think the narrative around HBAR is going to start evolving over the next couple of years, where I think instead of it being about investing in potential, it'll be more about investing in performance. And that's just what I think things are going to switch to over time. But again, I have no reason to think that it's not going to be able to perform. So don't interpret that as FUD. That's not what I'm trying to do there. All right, so the final thing I wanted to talk about here was just the different time frames of the UDPI for HBAR. So we have 3 different time frames that the model can look at. They can look at long term, months to years, medium term, weeks to months, and then short term, days to weeks are the kind of different moves that this tracks. And so what we can see is that across the board, they're actually telling pretty similar stories, right? We're at negative 2.33 long term, negative 2.21 medium term, negative 2.57 short term. So telling similar stories across the board. So my take here is that, long term, it thinks that HBAR has more realistic upside than downside to realize. Same with the medium term, same with the short term to about similar degrees. So we've kind of seen this bottoming out across all the different time frames, starting to realize some of that short-term upside potential, and we'll just want to watch and see what happens with this. If HBAR keeps running, I'd expect this to go up as well, and that's where I'd start then to look and see if it gets to some of these higher risk levels. That might suggest that in the short term it's starting to peter out and might need to consolidate for a while longer, or maybe even correct a little bit more before moving back to the upside. But just something to watch. Certainly right now I see nothing concerning from a risk perspective about HBAR. In the past, when we've been in these levels, it's usually precipitated moves to the upside, so it seems very plausible to me that that could happen again. Now again, a lot of that's going to be dependent on broader market conditions. What does Bitcoin do? If Bitcoin dumps, then I don't think HBAR is going to be able to decouple and run by itself. But if the broader market starts looking more bullish, then I see no reason why HBAR can't start realizing some of this upside potential. So not financial advice, make your own decisions. That's just my perspective. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with the UDPI, we're all going to make it.